I'm going to be talking about naming characters. It's a presentation I've given before, but it's always good to have a nice refresher. We'll talk about different strategies for naming characters and go through some examples and do some exercises together. But first, I am Daphne Strasser. I am an author and an editor. I specialize in editing genre fiction and I write speculative fiction of all sorts, but I work specifically with romance and horror as my main ones. I've been writing professionally since 2017, and I've been editing professionally for the past 3 years now. Um, so yeah, it's something about me. I work with Tomeworks, so you can find me at tomeworksedits.com or anywhere on the internet as Daphne the writer. But let's talk about naming characters. Oh, check my chat real quick. All right, naming characters. So why do character names matter? Your characters, why don't you just name your characters after your brother, your mom, your ex-boyfriend? Like, right? Why not just pick random names? Well, how your character is named makes their first impression is one of the first things we find out about them on the page. Names also can establish the genre of your work and give insight into your world. It makes your characters memorable, or it might foreshadow the character's role in the story. Pretty famously, J.K. Rowling loves to name her characters some form of pun or using foreign words that mean exactly who they are in the story. And so Remus Lupin was named two words that have a lot to do with wolves, so it should not have been any surprise to anybody that he turned out to be a werewolf. Um, so that's, and that's fun. And she writes for children's books. So it's not expected that children would know those things, but it is still a fun Easter egg when you find those things out. So, for example, let's talk about Richard William Fitzdarcy III. Um, how do you feel about this name? What image does that conjure up? And these are not rhetorical questions. I do actually want you guys to pop in the chat. Tell me what you think about it. So, what do you think of Richard William Fitzdarcy III?
I'm picturing someone very pompous.
Yeah. From the chat, Brandy says a wealthy person. That's absolutely reasonable. Typically, people who have this many names or a number at the end of their name are often from very established families where history, etc., is important in the family. Um, Mary says very, very English, especially with Fitzdarcy as a last name. So how do I picture this person? So this is kind of what I conjured in my mind thinking about Richard William Fitzdarcy III. Um, uh, Rhonda says someone whose genetics overshowers their hummingbird, but uh, so I was picturing someone very old money, very curmudgeonly. What do they do for their living? They either work in finance or they don't work at all. Um, I think they live in some sort of very old house covered in ivy. Doesn't remind me of anyone. Well, Fitz Darcy reminds me of Fitzwilliam Darcy, who is Mr. Darcy, but obviously I was not thinking of this person as being anything romantic. But having a bunch of uh old king-like names definitely makes me think old money, old English, definitely very wealthy. This name drips wealth. All right. In contrast, how do we feel about Helix Bretter? Anna says if he's not a baker, I'm gonna lose it. Bread, because his name is Breader. Not what I had in mind, but I love the jump. Mary says the parents were hippies but majored in the sciences. Anna says Helix is very sci-fi. It is indeed. Anytime you see, well, not anytime. Most of the time when you see an X in a name, it feels very modern or futuristic. Some examples of not that would be like Xavier or Xander, both of which are old names that have been that have X's in them. But when you most of the time when you're going to see the X's, like in Jackson, um, you're going to see it feel very future and. Brandy says feels very says Blade Runner, and like, yeah, that's kind of uh, so I was going in a futuristic sci-fi direction with this one. We've got Helix, which honestly, Helix is neither a male nor a female name, because it's really not a name at all. And so you have kind of a non-binary feel to it. The X, the genetic connection of like DNA gives it a very sci-fi feeling. And it says it could still be a baker. All right, so some general rules when you're naming your characters. You want to choose names that are clear, you want to choose names that are memorable, and you want to choose names that are distinct from one another. One of my pet peeves when reading a book is if I can't mentally pronounce the name, then while I'm reading the book, that person's name is just going to be a mumble in my mind. Unless I can truly figure out how to say it, I'm going to kind of gloss over it as I'm reading, and that makes your character a little more hard to remember. Not to mention, it's difficult for your readers to, if they're going to try and read it out loud, or if you have an audio reader or whatever, fans trying to interact with each other, not necessarily knowing how to say their names. So, important to focus on having clear, memorable, and distinct names. If you have a character named Aiden and a character named Adrian, you might have people confuse the two because those are very similar names. So if we're going to choose from names that already exist, and we'll talk about making up your own names later, but let's start with choosing names that already exist. Some things to consider first about your story, because this is all going to affect what name you pick. You're gonna these are all things that affect. So starting with oops, backspace. Starting very large, things to consider about your story. What genre are you working at? We talked about science fiction and fantasy. Both of those will allow inventing new naming conventions because you're working with a society that doesn't exist. If you're writing humor, you might be using names that are absurd or ironic. The story Snow Crash, which is not supposed to be humor, but we'll talk about it anyway, has a character named Hero Protagonist, which is an absolutely absurd name to give a character, but I mean, it works. Um, so think about your genre. Historical genres are going to require a little bit of research. You need to know about your setting, both time period and location, if you're going to be choosing from naming conventions that existed back then. In the chat, Rhonda has recommended behindthename.com and the surname version of it, which is surname .behindthename.com. This is my go-to tool for naming characters. We will actually go and work together and look at some of the tools that it provides and why it's better than like Nameberry or babynames.com. All right, we talked about genre. Let's talk about location. Where is this taking place? Naming conventions vary if you're, especially if you're talking about our world, Earth, modern day. Naming conventions vary depending on where you are in the world. So, Hayun might be a reasonable name for a character that's in Korea, but depending on who that character is, that might be really out of place if you're setting them somewhere else. So Midori is a relatively common Japanese name, but would be out of place if you're set in Ghana. Hold that thought. I know what you're all thinking. We'll talk about it in a second. And finally, time period. The name Jackson, specifically spelled with an X, definitely did not exist during the Victorian era, and Bertha would be kind of a weird name to see in 2022, 2025 now. But Bertha would be kind of a strange name to see in modern day because it's not as common anymore. But it's not just about your story, it's also about your character. All of these things have caveats, right? So Midori makes sense for a Japanese character living in Ghana. Even though it would be kind of odd to see that name, it would still fit her because of her heritage. And the character's age can also play a factor in this. So Bertha would be a grandmother's name or a great grandmother's name, while Jackson would be a relatively normal name for a kid to have. Um, and then your character talking about nicknames. Is your character Richard, Rich, Rick, Ricky, some odd nickname like Chard? Um, how do they feel about their name, right? So if Richard Fitzwilliam or Richard William Fitzdarcy III is actually a relatively young character, he may go by Ricky or Little Ricky. He might go by his middle name. He might go by Liam. Or he might have made up a totally different nickname that separates him from his family or heritage altogether. In the chat, Anna has said, for most of my work, I'm inventing names. So I make lists of words related to a specific character's occupation or role in the story and bastardize them into names and that I think feel like they could be actual names. This is a wonderful tactic, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more in the later part of the presentation. And finally, yeah, story role. You can give your characters more memorable names by more memorable names because you want them to stand out. Mary as a very common name, it might be a little forgettable when you're talking about your main character, unless it really ties to who she is. You can also make your villain names sound sinister. Um, and there's a number of ways to do that, including using the letter S in their name. How about gender? Um, Gender and how your character experiences gender and how your character expresses gender all also play a role in their name. Um, there are gendered names, and if your character is of a specific gender, they might have a gendered name. Or they might go against conventions, right? It might be a boy named Sue. Names like Ashley, Lindsay, Lori were all male names before they got taken over by women or women people, women characters, women naming. Um, those names used to be considered majority male. Now they're majority female. And so your character might get a name, a male character might have the name Ashley. How do they feel about that? How do they feel about a name that maybe was their grandfather's name and was more normal for a boy back then, but now isn't? All right. And then things to consider about the name. What does your character's name mean? A lot of people skip this step, and I think it's a really valuable tool, especially if you're looking at the great wide world of names and you don't have any inkling of what you want the character to be named. Looking up names based on meaning can give you a step in that direction. I have a very hard time naming characters just off of vibes. I want it to be connected to who they are somehow, either by their heritage or by what the meaning is in their story role, um, something like that, right? Otherwise, there's all these names out there, and you end up naming your character just like, oh, well, that sounds fun. And to me, that never sticks. Origin. A character does not always need to have a name from their origin. There's three little asterisks next to this because you need to be very careful of cultural appropriation. While the name Midori means green, and would be interesting for a character who has green skin. It, would they feasibly be named that by their parents, right? If their parents aren't Japanese or there's no concept of Japanese heritage in this, um, then the name is still gonna stick out even if the meaning is correct. The effect. Does the name strike others as rich, poor, unique, boring? Are there famous examples of people having the name? And at this moment, we are going to take a small detour to look at behindthename.com. Share. Okay. Welcome to behindthename.com. This is an extremely helpful resource. So let's start by looking up one specific name, my name, the name Daphne. All right, so things that is helpful here. Gender, feminine. Usage is from Greek mythology. It's used in English, it's used in Dutch. How you can pronounce it. And then its meaning in history. It means laurel in Greek. She was a nymph who turned into a laurel tree by her father. Um, and then you have related names, which is kind of fun if you're looking to like get variations on it or give a different heritage. Um, there's popularity rankings, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but here's something fun. Okay. Oh, they used to have a little scale for it. Let's look for it. Ratings. Okay. So people on this website have voted on the name, whether they consider it feminine, masculine, classic or modern, mature or youthful, formal or informal. It's just kind of a fun way to get a vibe for a name, right? Do other people consider the name the same way that I do? Um, since Anna is here, we'll go and look at a little bit of her vibe. So her vibe's a little bit different. It's going to be a lot more classic than Daphne is. Um, and so this can give you people's feelings on a name. Let's see, Jackson. Jackson gives you extremely modern, very youthful, very informal vibe. Okay. So another way we're going to use this tool. So um, let's say I'm going to write a bunch of college age students right now. So people that were born about 20 years ago. So this is a list of names by popularity. That's great. But this is the 24 ranking, but I'm not writing about babies. I'm writing about children, or I'm writing about teenagers and college students. So let's go back to 2004. And you'll see that the list of names is different. And so this gives me a better, if I'm creating a cast of characters, I've got a better range of ideas of what normal names were considered back then. So if you're writing college students and college students are reading this, they'll see names that seem familiar, right? When I was growing up, most common names were like Laura, Lauren. And there were a lot of Ashleys and Emilys and Torys, and so that has changed over time, right? These are different names than they used to be. And so, especially if you're writing a historical context, this kind of tool can be really helpful if I'm writing something from the 70s with children, like this might be helpful, that the names are completely different. All right, back to the presentation. Check my chat. Okay. And popularity. So now I showed you the list of popular names, and while it's helpful when you're building a cast to be able to pull from popular names, you may not want a super popular name for your character unless the story is something like Heather's, where the point is that all the characters are named Heather, or from Recess, the Ashleys. You may want to choose a name that's maybe not so high up in popularity. Anna says, Anna was extremely popular around the time I was born. My middle school of 100 kids had four Annas, two in my grade and two in the grade above me. Wow. I have only ever met one other Daphne, and when I met her, she was 5 years old, and I was like 25. So my name is growing in popularity, but is not something you still see very often. Other things to consider about the name, beyond just meaning and all of that. So the actual sound and feel of the name, the length. Is it short and quick, or is it a long, winding name like Gandalf has? Or sorry, Dumbledore has. Does the name rhyme with anything? Names that are very vowel heavy will feel softer than those with consonants. Names that have fricatives, that's like K's, like those names feel sharp. That's a hard way to describe it, but soft names have lots of vowels or L's or things like that. Um, Repetition. A litter of names are easy to remember. Um, Marvel, Stan Lee, when he was writing characters for Marvel, he often gave his characters alliterative names because they helped him remember who they were. So Peter Parker, uh, J. Jonah Jameson, those characters have alliterative names for a reason. Jean, you say Daphne makes me think of a Dark Shadows character, and you would be right. Daphne is a Dark Shadows character, and fun fact, my mother loved Dark Shadows. She's never admitted that my name was from a Dark Shadows character, but we also cannot rule it out. Um, and finally, visual cues. Does the name visually look like anything? I like to give an example here of a name, of a name that I gave a place in one of my uh books. All right, let's look at my video for a moment. All right, if you can look at my video. So this is Amana, which was the name of a kingdom that was in a mountainous region, and I chose that name because because Amana looked mountainous to me when it was written out. Fun fact. So let's talk about nicknames. Does your character have a nickname? Many people like to give their characters nicknames. It might be a shortened version of the name. It might be something that they're known for or from an event in their past. It might be embarrassing. Um, but there should be a reason for it. That even if it's just something you know. So consider as you have them have a nickname. Who uses it? Is it just their mom? Is it just their boyfriend? Um, is it everyone? And if it is everyone, uh, to my double warning, if it is everyone, what are you going to actually introduce their full name? Indiana Jones, for example, is Indiana Jones for the first two movies. And then in the third movie, we find out that his name is not actually Indiana. Indiana was the dog's name. And that's a fun reveal, but it wasn't brought up. He didn't introduce himself as Junior or whatever his actual name was. He introduced himself as Indiana. And so a lot of people, when they will introduce their characters first at the beginning, is like, ah, Amelia Johnson Jones was having a bad day. And then they jump into Mia. And no one calls her Amelia Johnson Jones for the rest of the book at all. She's always Mia. And so the question is, why would you introduce the name that way, right? It's an interesting detail about your character, but is it useful to the story? It also brings up an idea of point of view confusion. If you want your character, or if you want your story to have deep POV, which means your readers are very immersed in your character's mind, how does your character think about themselves? Do they consider themselves by their nickname? My also fun fact, Daphne was not my first name. Daphne is my middle name, or was my middle name. But I went by my middle name for my entire life. And so while my legal name was something else, I think of myself as Daphne. And so if I were writing a story from my perspective, I would only ever introduce myself as Daphne. Um, Here's my other warning. Be careful overusing nicknames. And what I mean by that is be careful giving your character too many nicknames. It is realistic for people to have nicknames depending on who they're talking to. It is not necessarily reasonable in your story to show it that way because it can create confusion. So just not that you can't do it, just be careful. All right. Let's talk about an example. So I've got my stuff laid out here. What type of story am I writing? What kind of person am I looking at? And I'll talk about how I named this person. I'm working in a genre of horror. We're at a theme park, and it's modern day. This is a white man who is 28. He is the villain of the story, and he's obsessed with Disney, and he loves the magic of childhood, and he will protect it at all costs, even if that means taking someone's life. So we've got a sinister character, but with the trappings of Disney and childhood. Here's what I went with. I went with Peter Blythe. Peter is a reference to Peter Pan. He's a beloved childhood character, and he's a boy who never grows up. So he's not giving up childhood. Peter Pan is, especially if you look at the Disney version, is a very friendly character. But if you think about the story and the implications too long, you realize it starts to get pretty sinister. The last name Blythe on the surface means happy and joyous, but it also sounds like blight, which is a disease that spoils and damages things. And it looks like the word scythe, which is a tool used by the Grim Reaper. So we have a name that can, on the surface, be kind of like happy, go lucky, it's childhood, it's magic. But if you look at it a little bit deeper, you start seeing that this is kind of sinister. Questions about stuff that we've talked about so far? Nope. Okay. Onward and forward. Okay, so resources, baby name websites. I talked about behind the name. There's also Nameberry or babynames.com. You can look at Wikipedia. You can look at ancestry.com. There's online name generators. So if you're struggling with made up names, you can do like fantasy name generators. There's Pinterest, which is interesting. There's whole boards dedicated to names. Um, And then there's just life experience. Some people, I have a fellow author who likes to go walking through graveyards to find names for characters. While graveyards are very pretty, I do not have any easily accessible pretty graveyards, so I don't usually do that. Plus, I like to look at meanings much more. Let's take another break um, to go look at behind the name again. I'll show you a different feature of it. Okay. Up here at the top, you'll see tools. Random name, random renamer, name translator, meanings, anagrams, baby name expert, surname site, place name site. So let's click on meanings. Let's say that you're like, okay, I know what role my person has in the story. I just want to see all the names related to that. Okay, great. Let's look at king or queen names. This gives you, oh, so many options that you can then go and, excuse me, you can go and look into more closely. They have close matches and they have loose matches. So these might be things, close matches might, it literally means king or it literally means queen or emperor or whatever. Loose matches might be this is the name of a famous king or famous queen. Um, so, for example, Rex means king, quite literally. Um, there are other meanings. When I was writing werewolf books, I spent a lot of time looking through the canine meanings to get names, which are fun. But let's say that you want something a little more robust, right? So you want a more specific search. That's where this stuff comes in. So I want feminine names that are used in English. Ah, used in English. Um, and I want them to mean light or bright or white. There's even more things you can do. Length, number of syllables, community impression, popularity. Well, let's start with what I did. And here's my set of names: Bertha, Blanche, Candida, Clara, Gwen, Gwenda, Phoebe, Roxana, Shirley, Tawny, and Whitney. Fun stuff. Um, okay. All right. I believe we have another example, and then we're going to talk about making up your own names. All right, so here's an exercise. I do not have, there is no correct answer to this. This is for you guys to enjoy. Put your ideas in the chat. This is an example. We're talking about a romance. We are at a traveling circus in the modern day. Our character is Hispanic woman. She's 23 years old. She's the protagonist of the story. She has spent her life traveling from town to town. She never makes any friends. She loves the trapeze and the tightrope, and she falls in love with the new ringmaster. So we're gonna take a couple minutes. We'll meet back at 1:40. And you guys come up with a couple of names for them, for her. Okay, that's about time. Rhonda has her offerings in the chat, Maria Lucia Hernandez y Gato, which is a little tongue-in-cheek, I think, fine. But Ariela Angelica Ruiz. I love the use of Ariela because Ariel is the Hebrew word for lion. And so you definitely get that cat-like thing. Angelica is a form of an angel. Um, which also gives you the idea of flying. I do not, off the top of my head, know what Ruiz means. But yes, this is a fantastic name for her. And I love the alliteration because the alliteration gives kind of a bouncy feel to it, which is again going to be the trapeze. Anyone else want to throw their names in the chat? If not, that's fine. Um, Brandy says Celine Valencia or Jessica Barrios. Nice. Celine, again, is going to be kind of like cielo, which is the sky. Um, language of flowers and crystal mancer stones are also options. There is a little to the language itself. I also love Valencia. While this may or may not be intentional, it looks like the word balance. Um, I don't know if that is what Valencia means, but it looks like the word balance, which works really well for the tightrope. Excellent choices, everyone. So let's create names from nothing, completely from scratch. We're not working within the bounds of our current society. Maybe you're working in a fantasy setting or a sci-fi setting, or you just want to come up with something truly, truly unique. Um, and so you're going to create new names. Um, Starting off, you can alter existing names. And this is something that people already do, creating interesting names and unique variations for their children. The aforementioned Jackson becoming Jackson with an X. Um, Ryan says the good old tragedy. Yes, there. If you do not know what he's referencing, there are a number of groups called "This Name is a Tragedy," which bemoan the use of using IEGH in names where that's completely unnecessary. There's also Gabriel or Gabrielle, which can be shortened into Brielle. Brian could just become Bryn, or Elizabeth could become Esbet. You can take normal names and you can just futz with them until they feel right to you. Can also use non-name words as inspiration. So this goes back to helix breeder that we did earlier. So helix and allele are both words associated with genetics that kind of feel like names. There's tourmaline and quartz, which are types of stones. These are my main characters for my science fiction romance that I'm writing, uh, in which stone imagery plays a very important role. Aches and Turn are both bird names. They give very, very sci-fi feel for a story that involves feathered people. And then there's meristem, which is a biological term associated with plants, but it's also being used here because mera is sounds like the prefix mera, meaning like maritime. So it's a plant word that's also associated with sailing. So if you are going to try and, especially with sci-fi, this works really great. If you're going to work with science fiction and fantasy, create a list of words that are related to what you want the major themes of your story to be. So if you're talking botanicals, go look up botanical terms, both for parts of plants and for plants themselves. If you want to do stones, go look up everything to do with geology and just make lists and try to dissociate yourself from the what you know the words actually mean and try to feel if they can feel like names to you. Then there's anagrams, rewriting words to mean something else. So villain can become Livelin and corporate can become Tora Praco. These things, these might fall into the realm of things your readers might be able to guess. And so depending on how important that is to you, use with caution. Right. And then there's intensive world building. And this is an example that Anna AP Hawkins has generously provided to us from her world building in her novel. And this has to do with how many people are in the generation. So you have the second in their line, the third in their line, the fourth in their line. And so these people would have progressively more complicated names. And this is something that doesn't even necessarily need to make it onto the page. You don't have to tell your readers this explicitly. But if you know it and you're using it, it can make your world building much more rich. And then this example. This is a tip from someone I saw on Tumblr, which is to keyboard smash and then divide into chunks and then to make those into more um, palatable name forms. And so you can end up with a nice little suite of not real names, but that are kind of name-ish. You have to watch out here for pronounceability and understandability. So that's what this step three is, which is making it easy enough to understand for it to work within your book. All right, another pet peeve of mine, apostrophes. Do you need them? Do you want them? Many times, sci-fi and fantasy writers will use apostrophes to make names look more exotic. There may or may not be a purpose, but it can make things difficult to read. Now, we do encounter apostrophes in our normal everyday life, right? And you wouldn't often think of it, but like O'Brien, for example, uses an apostrophe in it. D'Artagnan has an apostrophe. But then you can get into like Muad'Dib, which is from Dune. That's when we're starting to get I think, into the why did you include it? Did it really need to exist? Is it doing any work in this? Now, if you like it, if you just like how it looks, great. Just be careful and consider the readability of your names. All right, another exercise for us. We're doing science fiction. We're located on Saturn's rings, and we are far in the future. Our character is Indian. She is 15. She's a sidekick and a hacker. She loves surfing the galactic web with her VR set. She's plucky and fierce with a fondness for curse words. We'll take a couple minutes and reconvene at like 52 or so. Um, Go have some fun making a name for this character. All right, everyone, let's bring it back. We have a few in the chat. And if anyone wants to unmute, explain their name, that would be fine. I put in Lakshmi, which is a variation on Lakshmi, which then she would have shortened to Lax, and Bachchan meaning child, since she's such a young character. Ryan used Google Translate, trying related words until it isn't a loan word, starting with hacker, found locksmith, butcher until it sounded memey. It's a great way to do it, especially because we're working with a future sci-fi character. There's a lot of leeway to use variations on things or even non-word names or non-name words. All right. Well, that's all I have. We still have time to talk if you guys have questions. Um, but this is my contact information. I am Daphne Strasser. Again, I am a author and an editor. You can find out more about me at daphnestrasser.com or at toneworksedits.com, which I'll put in the chat. And you can find me pretty much everywhere on the internet as Daphne the Writer. I have a few minutes for questions if anyone has one, but other than that, that is it for us. And next week we will be talking about how to write an antihero with Shannon Winton. Bye, everyone.